My favorite kind of stories about little kids are the ones where the little kid does something at a very young age that is indicative of who they are and what they're into and how they turned out to be later. And my little boy Marius had a moment like this that I think is going to be one of those the other day. We had this little pond and we have some fish in there. I had to drain the pond. And so my little boy waded out into the pond. I'm like, hey, buddy, what are you doing? You're going to scare the fish. He's like, that one looks nervous. I think I'm going to go pet it. I said, okay, well, you can try, knowing that fish do not get petted. And all the other fish scattered, but the one that he was pointing at sat right there. And he's just sitting there looking at him, and he reaches out his little hand, like, oh, it's going to make him jump. And the fish didn't take off. It just sat there. And my little boy just started to pet this fish. And I couldn't believe it. And then he's like, Dad, I'm going to tell him some stuff. He puts his face in the drink and starts, like, bubble talking to this fish. I'm like, what did he say, buddy? Dad, he's a fish. He didn't say anything. Okay, I get how it is. But I think I'm starting to see who that kid is going to turn out to be. And I think just by the way things are unfolding in Luke chapter 2, we're starting to get a sense, even from Jesus' earliest kid stories, who he's going to be and why he's going to matter later on. And that's what this passage is all about. It's also a huge passage. So this is one of those where I really need you to pause it and read the whole thing for yourself. We're going to be in Luke chapter 2, verses 21 all the way through 40, and I don't have time to read it all. So pause, read, and then we'll get cracking on these important and interesting stories about little baby Jesus and little kid Jesus. This passage breaks down really neatly into 3 parts. And the first one is verses 21 through 24. And this is an interesting little section because as modern readers, we're like, well, I don't care about any of these rituals. But to the original audience, this would have really mattered because there were serious questions as Luke was writing this account as to who Jesus was really loyal to. Was he here to blow up the whole Jewish thing, or was he the completion of the whole Jewish thing? And for a lot of people, there would have been a cultural suspicion that if his family didn't raise him Jewish, well, there you go. Now we know where he really stood. So Luke goes out of his way to accommodate that part of his audience to say, dude was pretty Jewish. He was circumcised, as creepy as it is to know the status of the risen Lord Jesus on that topic. Now you know, because it's in the Bible. He was a part of a family where his mother went through the proper ritual purification after giving birth. If you want to know more about that, just read the whole Old Testament. It'll be in there somewhere. And third, they went to the temple to make the sacrifices that were culturally appropriate for having a kid at this time. And we also know that they were poor because they could only afford the cheap version of the sacrifices. The whole gist of this whole section is his parents did it right by Jewish standards, and Jesus was absolutely raised in a legitimate Jewish home. So after the presentation of the baby at the temple, we run into part 2 of this passage, which is all about 2 very unique blessings that the baby Jesus receives. Now, to a Jewish audience, this would have been important because the 2 characters from whom he receives the blessing, Simeon and Anna, were temple rock stars. They were people who everyone who was alive around 4 BC and hanging out in Jerusalem around the temple would have known. They were reputable. They'd been there longer than anybody could remember. And they were people who were forward-looking. They were people who didn't give in to the negativity and skepticism and political vitriol of the age, but instead seemed to have this long view of what God was going to do redemptively among their people. And so everyone would have known where these 2 stood, and when Jesus shows up and receives their blessing, it would mean a lot to people who recognize these 2 names. Quickly, though, I want to mention why this would have mattered again to the Greek audience. Last time around, I talked about how the Greeks would have expected some kind of oracle, some kind of pronouncement about someone important descending from the heavens. Well, Luke's writing to Greeks and Jews, and so these sort of blessings would have been very important to that non-Jewish audience in the Eastern Mediterranean world to validate Jesus as someone from whom to expect something big coming down the road. Simeons Blessing breaks down into 2 parts. The first one goes like this: Sovereign Lord, as you've promised, you now dismiss your servant in peace. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you've prepared in the sight of all people, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and for glory to your people Israel. 2 things here. One, it's kind of a somber moment as this old guy says, I can die in peace. I saw what I was holding on for. But 2, in addition to all the stuff about salvation, redemption that you'd expect, there's this key line where he says, a light for revelation to the Gentiles. In other words, Simeon got something that a lot of other people don't get throughout Luke and Acts, and that is that the whole Jesus thing was meant for everybody all along. And so it's key that that little part of this blessing appears early on, because right from the get-go, it's made clear this is what Jesus is going to be about. And if you're not into that, you're not really on board with Jesus. The second part of his blessing is a little more somber as he's speaking to Mary and Joseph. He says, this child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed, and a sword will pierce your own soul too. Mary's smart, she's faithful, she's demonstrated remarkable character through all of this already. I think she can read between the lines that this is going to be a tough go. So that's Simeon's blessing. Anna's blessing, we don't actually have the dialogue on, so I don't know exactly what she said, other than it's made clear by the text that she doubled down on what Simeon was saying. She echoed the stuff that had been said about Jesus, quoting from the prophet Isaiah, and all this stuff about Jesus being the Redeemer, the hope, the salvation for Israel and for others. And she was proclaiming this as an old lady to anybody who would listen in the temple. So this is certainly not your average baby presentation that would happen day in and day out in Jerusalem. Something pretty unique is happening here, and anybody who was around on that day would have remembered it. And finally, part 3 is just a quick growth montage. Verse 39 says, when Joseph and Mary had done everything required by the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. And the child grew and became strong. He was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. Two things we get from this passage. One, he was raised in a relatively normal Jewish household with relatively normal Jewish parents, and that is the context of his upbringing, which is just helpful to know. But two, he's called wise, and wisdom isn't really something we generally expect from a kid, especially when they're dealing with the deepest, most complex subjects in life. And let me just throw this out as an example. These are lyrics to a song written by a young Canadian. You know you love me, I know you care. Just shout whenever and I'll be there. Rhymes. You are my love, you are my heart, and we will never, ever, ever be apart. Also rhymes. Are we an item? Girl, quit playing. We're just friends. What are you saying? Say there's another and look right in my eyes. My first love broke my heart for the first time. And I was like, baby, 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 oh. Like baby, 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 no. Like baby, 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 oh. I thought you'd always be mine. Mine. My point is, that might not be the best effort at explaining love and heartbreak in the history of humanity, but you know, it's not a bad effort for a kid. Just intuitively, we know kids aren't particularly wise. They might be smart, they might be precocious, they might be spunky, but they're not wise. And that's what makes it all the more remarkable that people viewed Jesus as wise, even as a little kid. And we're going to get into that more next episode. I have some observations, and the first two are really fast. One, all the people in this passage, as best as they understood it at their moment in history, were trying to play their part and do what they were supposed to do to be faithful to God as they understood it. Looks different than how we might conceive of it today, but I just think there are a bunch of admirable characters here who deserve a tip of the hat. Second thing, I really like seeing a couple of these aged characters on camera for a little while who did not let their pursuit of the big questions of life and death and existence and God and human purpose go into cruise control once life got comfortable. These are people who stayed at it, and who knows where you or I will end up with those big questions of life given a whole lifetime. But I aspire to be somebody who keeps chasing after this stuff instead of getting complacent or just burying my head in the sand to avoid thinking about difficult things. Again, tip of the hat to a couple of admirable characters. A third observation. You got about a zillion different kinds of characters in the first 2 chapters, all pointing to the same thing about Jesus, that he's from God, that he's something special, and that somehow, even though they might not get it exactly yet, this redemption that's been promised, not just to Israel, but the whole world, is going to be initiated or even fulfilled through him. I think having all these different characters on screen from all different walks of life and ages and everything else really is an indication of how things are going to turn out in history in response to Jesus. Remember, we started this whole video talking about baby stories, and the best baby stories are the ones where little tiny baby did cute stuff that pointed to what they were going to be and what they were going to do later. It's kind of the same thing here. The way things unfolded around Jesus' birth and early childhood are kind of indicative of the way they would unfold in response to Jesus for the 2,000 years that have passed since. A whole lot of people from a whole lot of different places responding to this character and the redemption that comes with him. Here are 2 red subscribe buttons. One of them, and I'm not telling you which, will actually subscribe you to my channel. The other one is going to take you to the video of my son petting that fish from the story that I opened with. It's going to melt your heart and break your brain with adorableness. I'm Matt. I'll catch you soon.